Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Howe, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University. Dr. Howe is a human environment geographer specializing in the human dimensions of climate change and environmental hazards. Prior to joining Utah State University, Dr. Howe was a postdoctoral researcher at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He received his PhD from the Department of Geography at Penn State University, and his current research focuses on the intersection of human perception and decision-making with societal vulnerability and adaptation to climate change and environmental hazards. Please welcome Dr. Peter Howe.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here. I wanted to give a little bit of a deeper dive onto the social science of climate change. This is what I do a lot of my research on, and give you guys a sense of what the landscape of public opinion and public attitudes, public perceptions about climate change are right now in the US, with a focus on the West and with a focus on rural areas that I'll get to in a little bit. Guess we're having a little bit of problems with the slides, but so this is where we're headed. So I'm going to give you just a sense of what the state of opinion about climate change is here in the US, and then dive into some differences, variation at the subnational level. So we've been able to look at changes or variations between states and within states all the way down to the county level. And then I'll close with a few strategies, best practices for communicating about climate change from some of the recent social science literature in this area. Okay, so what do we know about public perception? So most Americans for a while have known that climate change is happening, or that global warming is happening. As of the most recent data, we have about 2/3, 70% or so of Americans do think that global warming is happening, and these are from large national surveys representative of the US population. That number has been relatively consistent going back for several years. You'll see this is in 2008. It was similar to as it is now. There was a dip down into 2010. We all know what happened between 2008 and 2010. We had the economic collapse and people had other concerns on their minds. That number has gone up a little bit since then, but it's stayed roughly consistent. Around 2/3 of the public think that global warming is happening. When it comes to the portion of Americans who think global warming is human caused, that number, here it is up here, has stayed roughly consistent at about half of Americans over that same period. So more people think global warming is happening than think it's human caused. And again, you know, there's another about a third of the population think that global warming, if it's happening, is not caused by humans in any way, and it's caused mostly by natural changes. One of the things that we've been looking at in survey research too is how people are talking among themselves about climate change and global warming. And we've actually seen changes over time in this where people have been less likely to talk about climate change over the past few years. So going back to 2008 again, up to 2015, more people are saying they rarely or never talk about global warming with their friends and family. And people who say they discuss it often or occasionally, that percentage has been going down a little bit too. When it comes to the kind of connotations of global warming, what people consider global warming to be related to in terms of different issues, it's largely thought of as being an environmental issue too. So over 60, almost 70% of people think that in large part, global warming is an environmental issue. But people also associate global warming with being a science issue, a scientific issue, as well as related to agriculture. And severe weather, health, and economic issues are still are quite heavily associated with global warming. We also know that public perceptions of global warming are quite related to our perceptions of the scientific consensus. And I'll come back to this at the end. There's actually a large portion of the public who doesn't doesn't understand or doesn't know about the current state of the scientific consensus about global warming. The fact that there is a large proportion, 97%, 95, 99, depending on the paper that you read, of climate scientists or climate science papers that say that global warming is happening and human-caused. Not many people actually know about that number, so when you ask people what that percentage of scientists is, only about 1 in 10 Americans get close there. 1 in 10 Americans think that more than 90% of climate scientists think that global warming is happening. So there's still a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of lack of awareness of the extent of scientific consensus on this issue. So another feature of how we tend to think about global warming is that it's psychologically distant from us, both in terms of space and in time. When you ask people what kinds of harms global warming is going to cause, most people associate those harms with things that are going to happen far away. It's going to cause impacts in developing countries. It's going to cause impacts for plants and animal species. It's going to cause impacts in the future for people, but not necessarily to them. This is the proportion of people that think global warming is going to harm them personally, all the way up to plant and animal species. So it's still a relatively distant threat, both in space and in time. Oh. We'll get that figured out. Okay, good, that's better. Okay, so you get a sense of, here's threat to you personally, threat to your family, threat to people in the US, threat to people in developing countries, or future generations, or other species. So you get a sense of that this issue is still relatively psychologically distant. One difference, and this is a little bit out of step with beliefs about global warming as an issue, is that people tend to be very supportive of specific policies that will address climate change, these kinds of mitigation and adaptation type policies, when they're described not necessarily in connection to climate change, but when these policies are just described in and of themselves. So we have relatively strong support for funding for infrastructure to make infrastructure more resistant to extreme weather that's going to be associated with climate change. We have strong support for providing incentives for people to purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels, support for research into renewable energy, or support for regulating CO2 as a pollutant. Still, most of the public either strongly or somewhat supports regulating CO2 or requiring utilities to have a renewable portfolio standard to produce at least 20% of their electricity from renewable sources. Those still get relatively large margins of support among the American public as a whole. So the numbers I've been giving you have been for the US as a whole, but in order to get a better sense of what people in your neighborhood or your community or county, your city, what they're thinking, we really need to kind of dive down and develop some methods to figure that out, because it's not necessarily feasible to go out and survey everyone in your county, everyone in the next county, everyone in the county repeatedly over time, even to see how these things are changing. So some of the work that I've been doing over the past couple of years with colleagues has been to take all this survey data that we have nationally about climate change, about what people think about climate change, and do what we're calling downscaling, where it's similar to downscaling of the climate science data, climate temperature projections, for example, except we're downscaling social data. So these really local level estimates of what percentage of people support certain policies, what percentage of people believe that climate change is a concern for them. These can be helpful for policymakers, certainly, so they can know what their constituents are thinking about this issue. Can also be helpful for communication and planning and education efforts, and likely for managers when you're going out and talking to the public to have a better sense of what the public is likely to think about this issue. So these estimates that I'm going to present are built on a large set of opinion data from these national surveys. Right now we have about 14,000 responses nationally going back to 2008 that are driving this model. From representative surveys. We have multiple questions about attitudes about global warming that have been asked the same way in every survey. And we have then also validated these results with a series of independent surveys in selected geographic areas. And they've also been validated by another research group as well. So we're fairly confident of the numbers. Of course, there is a margin of error. So at the state level, the numbers that I'm going to present have a margin of error of around 5 points. At the county level, it's higher. We're projecting down to over 3,000 counties. So we have a margin of error of around plus or minus 8 points. But that is still, that margin of error is equivalent to going out and surveying 150 people in every county in the US, or over 400,000 people. And we have found with these validation efforts that these estimates validate quite well. They are quite accurate when we compare them to the surveys that we did in 4 states and 2 cities. Here are our estimates as compared to the independent survey data on the x-axis, and our estimates are there on the y-axis. We found that the average difference between our estimates and the validation data was around 3 percentage points for states and a little less than 4 for cities, which is within the margins of error of those separate surveys that we did. So we can be relatively confident that these numbers are as accurate as if we had gone out and surveyed that particular jurisdiction. Okay, so here's some results. So here at the state level, this is the proportion of people who think that global warming is happening across US states. Here is the proportion who believe that global warming is human-caused. And you'll see there's quite a bit of variation, although, again, just nationally, as we saw, there's about 2/3 of people who think global warming is happening. In every state, the majority of people do think that global warming is happening. There's more disagreement about the anthropogenic cause of global warming. There's a lot less understanding or a lot less agreement that most scientists think global warming is happening. So understanding of the scientific consensus is low across the states, although there is variation. And again, when it comes to specific policies, we do have support across all states. Actually, majorities in every state support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. Okay, and then when it comes to Utah, just for some locally specific numbers, about 59% here in Utah think that global warming is happening. 42% think it's mostly human-caused. And then 37% believe that most scientists think global warming is happening. 61% support regulating CO2 as a pollutant here in Utah. So we can also drill down to the county level to look at variation within states, which is actually quite substantial as well. So we have variation across the country between states, but also within states. There's fairly large variation depending on the state that you look at. Even in California, where 70% in the state thinks that global warming is happening. That goes from a low of 61% in one county to 79% in another county. So there's still variation within California. There's also variation within, for example, within Wyoming, which is on the relatively low side statewide, but that varies from 44% in one county to 64% in another county, Teton County, where Jackson is. Okay, and here's just focusing on the West. This is that percentage of people who think that global warming is happening. You'll see that in almost every county across the country, all but 75 of those counties have more than 50% of their population who think that global warming is happening. We do have a few who are just below that 50% threshold, a couple here in Utah, Emory and Millard County, a couple in Wyoming. But there is, in almost every county in the country, we do have majorities who believe that global warming is happening. When you look at worry, so concern or risk perceptions are one of the things that we look at. That also varies quite a bit geographically. Here is counties that are more worried in orange, counties that are less worried are in blue, in between are in white here. There's quite a bit of variation. Again, some of the patterns they follow what you might expect. There is certainly a red state, blue state divide here too. Happy to talk about the role of political ideology when it comes to climate change perceptions. But again, there is variation even when you get within states. Okay, when it comes to the scientific consensus, again, here's people who think that most scientists believe that global warming is happening. Most counties, there are less than 50% of the population, believes that, going all the way down to 24% in a county in Texas and up to 66% in New York. Okay, one of the things that we've also found is that depending on the policy question that you ask or the specific type of perception or attitude that you ask about with regards to climate change, there are certain spatial relationships that are really obvious when you look at these maps. So one of them is when you ask about support for setting CO2 limits on coal-fired power plants. And probably not surprisingly, there's a strong relationship between places with local fossil fuel industries, coal-fired power plants, most evidently, and support for this particular policy. So in Millard and Emery County in Utah, in these counties in Wyoming that have coal-fired power plants and coal extractive activities, you see that strong relationship. Although those counties are islands in a relatively high level of support nationally for this particular policy. Okay, and then I wanted to focus a little bit too on some differences between urban and rural counties. And what we've seen when we break out our results this way is that we don't actually see major differences between urban and rural counties across the country on average. So here with our rural counties in light blue, our urban counties in dark blue, there's roughly a 5 percentage point difference, with rural counties generally having lower levels of belief about any of these questions that we ask. When it comes to, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to switch back and forth between these. When it comes to those particular policy questions, like regulating CO2 as a pollutant or funding research into renewable energy, there's less differences between urban and rural counties. There's still broad support no matter where you are. If we look at variation between regions, in particular rural counties, we actually see that the West, rural counties in the West, come out as having the highest levels of belief that global warming is happening, that it's human-caused, and that there's a scientific consensus and levels of worry about global warming. So across rural counties in the West, Midwest, Northwest, and Northeast, and South, the West comes out as having the highest levels across all of these different belief questions. And then when we map these particular rural counties, this is just a map. Unfortunately, it's cut off again. But if we look at the most worried counties and the least worried counties in the rural U.S., the West actually has a lot of those most worried counties. So the most worried ones are here in the orange. The least worried ones are here in purple. And most of these western states have rural areas where worry is quite high, at the high end of the distribution. Here's that list. These are the most worried counties, 15 top most worried counties, lowest, and the 15 counties with the lowest level of worry. We actually see 11 of those 15 are in the West, in Alaska, New Mexico, Hawaii, Colorado, and California, and Washington, actually. We only have 3 of those of the least worried counties in the West, 2 of which are in Utah, one of which is in Idaho. Okay, and so these data are available online. You can go in and look at county level data, any county in the U.S., congressional district level data, state level data. Here at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication or at my website. You can download these data as well if you want to create your own maps. We have a number of different questions that you can map at these different levels. And then in my remaining time, I just wanted to connect these numbers, these kind of raw numbers that I've been giving you, to how you can actually use those in communication. So this is a question that we get as social scientists a lot, which is how do we actually then go out and communicate these issues appropriately to our particular audiences. One of the things these numbers can do is give you a sense of what your audience already thinks about climate change. And the short answer is there is no one-size-fits-all strategy, so it helps to consider pre-existing beliefs of your audience or your area. One of the best practices for communication in general, and this applies to climate change, as well as communicating relevant messages, so messages that are, for example, talking about relevant local impacts in your particular area, from trusted sources, right? So in some of these rural counties, hearing a message about climate change from Al Gore is probably not going to be very effective. That are repeated often, right? So most people tend not to think about or talk about climate change very often in their daily lives, and it's not a very top-of-mind issue, so it can help to repeat these messages multiple times. Another message strategy, going back to the fact that climate change is still relatively psychologically distant for a lot of people. Remember that most people still see climate change as something that's affecting people in the future or affecting places farther away. It's a problem for polar bears, not necessarily themselves. So communicating about local issues related to climate change impacts can certainly be a helpful strategy, although it's important at the same time to couple those messages about local impacts with messages about what they specifically can do. So whether they're adaptation strategies or mitigation strategies, actual behaviors that are achievable by people coupled with messages about local impacts are likely to be the most effective. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight some research that's been done recently by some colleagues of mine that's been focusing directly on communicating the extent of the scientific consensus about global warming, which, as we saw, there's still a lot of misunderstanding of what the scientific consensus actually is. Most Americans are not aware of the extent of that scientific consensus, the fact that global warming is happening and caused mostly by humans. So actually communicating, there's been some experimental work done by my colleagues that's shown that just communicating that extent of the scientific consensus can be an effective way of not only teaching people about this issue, but also potentially leading them to change their minds about whether climate change is actually happening or not, the extent that they're concerned about climate change, and the extent that they might support public action or individual behaviors themselves to respond. So with that, I'll direct you to some helpful resources for climate change communication, the Yale program on climate change communication. There's a similar program at George Mason. There's a great resource out of the UK called Climate Outreach that provides specific communication strategies for talking about these issues. And then thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
So, in my experience, the people that are skeptical about human-caused climate change are skeptical about scientists in general. So, communicating that scientists have a consensus isn't working. Do you have any suggestion about that?
Yeah, so that's a good point. The experiments that I just mentioned have been done with the general public as a whole, and they haven't broken down potentially that small percentage of people who don't trust scientists. When you look at large surveys that ask people how much they trust different institutions or different groups, scientists still come out as among the top 3 most trusted institutions, up there with the military and doctors, medical practitioners. So for most people, this messaging strategy is likely to be relatively effective. For people who tend not to trust scientists at all, my sense is that it would be less effective. Yeah. And for some people, you're just not ever going to change their mind. That's just the reality.
Find out, say, you know, I mean, I think if I could say to might be a more meaningful thing to communicate? Is there somewhere that you might know of to find that sort of localized data?
Yeah, so the question is where can we find localized climate projections? And there are several sources out there. One of them is a great project recently released by a group called Climate Central. And it's a website called Weather Shift, or wxshift.com. And that actually, it provides local weather forecasts coupled with future climate projections down to the local level. So you can put in your city or your area, and it'll provide a number of different localized climate projections about, say, the number of heat wave days that you will experience in 2050 or 2100 under different emission scenarios, or the number of extreme flooding events. It gets quite detailed. The USGS also has a portal for getting downscaled climate projections. So I would just Google USGS climate downscaling portal for that. It's called Weather Shift, or WX Shift. Yeah.
Why were there negative feelings in Utah, Wyoming, and didn't list that in the Appalachians? Because it's also.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Why weren't there negative feelings towards climate change in the Appalachian region? Like
Yeah.
you saw in parts of Utah and Wyoming.
Yeah, so we did see relatively lower levels of belief and concern in the Appalachians. Part of that is a function of the maps that I presented. So counties there just tend to be smaller, so picking up on those spatial patterns might not be obvious if I was just showing the nationwide map. We did see, just like in the West, coal-producing counties in the Appalachians, West Virginia and Kentucky, tended to have lower levels of concern and lower levels of support for policies, climate change policies. Yeah.
Are you aware of any efforts to look at, gather data regarding the type of media source that some of these individuals, where they get their information, media outlets?
Mm-hmm.
The literature on media consumption focuses on selective exposure, so individuals seeking information that come from sources that align with their faith system.
Yeah, so there has.
That's one of the differences we see here.
Right, so the question is about research into selective exposure to different media sources among people who have different sets of beliefs about climate change. Yeah, so I would direct you to the Yale program on climate change communication. They have several reports based on survey data that have asked specifically about which sources of media different groups tend to rely on.
With that, we're going to have to turn to our next presenter. But let us please thank Dr. Howe for his presentation.
Thank you.